A master builder and a maestro architect, a renowned Chinese-American architect, IM Pei, has died. He was 102 years old. His works are seen as embracing modernity, tempered by a grounding in history. And that legacy that IM Pei leaves behind is one that encompasses everything from commercial skyscrapers to art museums. His works feature futuristic geometric patterns and were built using a mixture of stone, glass and steel. His most controversial project was the 70-foot tall glass pyramid at the Louvre Museum in Paris. Many criticized the design before it opened in 1989 because its modern look clashed with the historic buildings around it, but it's since become a much-loved French landmark. He also built the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland, Ohio, in the United States, and Mr. Pei is said to have researched the roots of rock and roll for inspiration. In Hong Kong, his Bank of China Tower was the tallest in Asia when completed in 1989. The 72-story building remains one of the city's most recognizable landmarks. In the Middle East, his design for the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha transformed the city's skyline, blending modern lines with ancient Islamic architecture. In Berlin, it's hard to miss Mr. Pei's striking glass exhibition hall at the German Historical Museum in the nation's capital. This museum in southeastern China, is considered to be one of his most important works, as it was built in his hometown of Suzhou. Incorporating Chinese classical landscape painting, the award-winning architect designed the Suzhou Museum with his sons, who followed in their father's footsteps, becoming architects. Now, for more on IM Pei's work, Dr. Eunice Seng, Associate Professor of Architecture at the University of Hong Kong, she joins us live from our Hong Kong studio. Dr. Seng, what do you think Mr. Pei will be most remembered for?
Well, I think, if anything, it would be his very strong geometry, imbued with a sense of cultural sensitivity. So he would, we could put him easily as among the first to be able to navigate the global scene for architecture, and to be able to almost seamlessly, at least from our perspective, to be able to move from Egyptian iconography to the Middle East to Chinese symbolism very effortlessly.
So what would you say, what would you say would make him stand out to other modern architects, though?
I think you have to think of it in two aspects. One, if you situate in him in the context of what was happening in the post-war corporate America, the rise of the skyscraper in the sort of glass and steel sense, he then come in taking the same language, but also on the ground be able to speak in terms of each specific context, so be it feng shui, or be it historical references to a particular rockery, or when it comes to the Louvre, talking about ancient civilizations. So that in context already set him apart to be able to, despite the fact that often he's portrayed as the Chinese American, but beyond that, he's also picked up the kind of cultural persona to speak beyond just for the Chinese. So if you bring this all the way forward to the present, and his very prolific practice, allow him to hone that he has been doing that since, I think he has a prolific career of 60 years. And he's been very consistent in that. And that applies not just to his cultural work, but also to other projects, civic projects, and even shopping centers like Raffles City.
Well, Mr. Pei's legacy is certainly evident around Asia, in Hong Kong, Singapore, and Japan, for example. How did he influence architectural landscape in this region?
I think one of the things is timeliness. Take the context of Singapore, for example. He was very much part of an era when Singapore was at a developmental stage where master planning, urban design, Marina South, for example, Raffles City, the whole downtown core area was having was going through a different stage of development, rethinking the downtown, what it means to extend, to rethink the coastline. And so when it comes to the timeliness of his influence, it's not just architecture, but also thinking at a much larger scale in urban design, planning. And so for that, I think it's very influential, both for private practices who are beginning to see architecture not as only discrete buildings, but also in terms of the larger city, but also for planning bodies like the URA, for example.
All right, speaking of being influential, but, you know, what kind of an impact do you think his work, you know, has had in America and Europe?
I think there are actually more experts who can speak on that. So I'm going to speak from the perspective of where looking outwards there. I think let's start with America. Because of his training with some of the most well-known and also grounded modern masters, he was very much part of the generation of students who graduated at the cusp of the war, of World War II. And really we're seeing corporate America, post-war America, the changing of scenes of metropolises. And so when he came in, he added another layer to that corporate experience of if you look at his museums in the 60s onwards, he started to think in terms of landscape, in terms of cultural symbolism, and that really introduced a dimension that has made him that has allowed him to differentiate himself from the modern masters, and allow him also, going back to my first point, to navigate quite seamlessly, which is why he was able to, in a way, cut across the cultural boundaries of being able to then go to the Middle East, go to Japan, which something for a Chinese architect would be very sensitive. And in Europe, I think, despite the fact that the Louvre has always been described as being his most controversial and so on, if you look at in the context of the grand projects that had been in place in Paris from the 70s, for example, you'll see that actually in that context they were all controversial. And so in that sense, he brought in that sensibility that he had been honing for 2 decades in the US. And introduced this pyramidal form, which I thought was very, very clever, and brought light into something that otherwise, in the context of a place like France, would be very, very sort of unusual.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you so much for your insights. We've been speaking there with Dr. Eunice Seng, Associate Professor of Architecture at the University of Hong Kong.